from the National Catholic Register. This is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
At the Democratic National Convention this week, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have officially accepted their party's nomination for president and vice president. Protecting abortion access ended up being one of the clearest policies on display at the convention. The Register's senior writer Peter Laffin joins us from Chicago with analysis of this historic presidential campaign. And then, as students head back to school around the nation, some states have kicked cell phones out of schools. We look into the growing trend of cell phone-free school days with EWTN news reporter Roselle Reyes. I'm Jeanette DeMello, Executive Director of the National Catholic Register and Catholic News Agency. I'm your host here on Register Radio, joined by my co-host Matthew Bunson, who is the Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. So delegates to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago have approved a party platform that doubles down on abortion, IVF, gender-affirming health care. As usually is the case at major party conventions, this was an opportunity to galvanize support around the party's ticket. So that's Harris-Walz, and it's a short sprint for them, 75 days to November 5th, making this one of the shortest bids for the White House and thus making it historic. Peter Laffin is a Register writer who was at the convention. He joins us now. Peter, you were in Chicago. What was the atmosphere like at the Democratic National Convention?
Well, Jeanette, it's great to speak with you. The atmosphere here in Chicago has been, I think you could describe it as manic, and also somewhat disjointed. Inside the convention hall, there seems to be this repeated insistence that everyone is experiencing a great amount of joy. That word has been repeated hypnotically throughout my 3 days so far in Chicago. And every speaker has pointed to it in some way. But outside of the convention, outside of the walls of the hall, there are a few city blocks that are walled off, very high barricades, very muscular-looking men with very big AR-15s guarding the perimeter. It's taken me every day about an hour and a half to get through security. It took me about 3 hours to get my credentials on Monday. And especially on the first 2 days, you could see a very heavy helicopter presence above during the protest. So you could actually see from just outside the hall, across the park, there are helicopters monitoring protests who are screaming incredibly angry things. And so we have this very strange blend of emotions happening here.
Absolutely. I mean, we can't see. We don't see what's happening on the outside there. We've got a couple of glimpses of it. I believe there were arrests with pro-Palestinian protests outside of an embassy, an Israeli embassy, and I know there were some arrests there. And, of course, we've seen images of abortion van and some abortion-related protests. But it's very interesting to note that dichotomy between what's happening on the inside. And you're right, joy and hope have been some of the key words of the convention, entertainment and the speeches. I just can't believe what a different moment this is than just a month ago. When the Democratic Party all but ousted President Biden from their ticket, and we're really wondering how things would coalesce around Kamala, and they seem to have coalesced with her vice presidential pick, Tim Walz. We kind of got, he's the governor of Minnesota, but we really got a debut on the national scene from him on Wednesday night. How did people react to him? What were you seeing and hearing on the ground, or maybe even from the commentary you've read on his speech?
Well, I think it's important to remember that for all of us, those of us who are really plugged into the news and those of us who aren't, we're all getting introduced to Tim Walz. A month ago, none of us knew who he was. Very few people in America could have named the governor of Minnesota. And so what we've seen over the last few weeks is a race to define him by both sides. And you have the Democratic effort to define Tim Walz as sort of, I've heard some people say, the East Coast, West Coast elite person's idea of a Midwestern white guy who, has guns, has been in the military, though some of the details surrounding his military service appear to have a tenuous relationship to straight truth. And so that was on display very clearly last night. We had his football team come out to a marching band. And all of a sudden the Democratic Party, you can see, has become very patriotic. We've seen a lot of USA chants break out, and that's something I haven't seen in a long time. So it seems that playing up to Tim Walz's persona as a Midwestern everyman patriot has been very important to them. If you look at Walz's record, it tells a very different story. The campaign theme of freedom for the Harris campaign, it's a big departure from where Biden was. Biden's tone was very sort of apocalyptic. It's a threat to democracy. The world's going to end. Kamala has made a case in the positive for freedom. And Tim Walz has been a vehicle to make this case. Freedom in the sense that line he said when he was announced as the running mate, mind your own dang business, I think he said. Freedom to do whatever you want. But this is the exact same governor who set up a COVID tip line where you could call a state authority and squeal on your neighbor for violating social distancing norms or rules at the time. This is somebody who has used the executive power of his office to clamp down, particularly on religious freedoms as well, on the people that he's governed. And that's really what his record shows. So you see sort of this warped understanding of the concept of freedom. For listeners, I would encourage to read our publisher Michael Warsaw's commentary editorial from last week on the two concepts of freedom and how the Harris campaigns and the Tim Walz's of the world, their understanding of that word is quite different than ours.
Yeah, talking about the very slick campaign, certainly the convention has been very well produced. They're using deliberate uses of the color purple, for example, to suggest and reach out to undecided or middle of the road or the purple voter. But we're also seeing not a lot of detail from the Harris-Walz campaign on policy positions, and even the New York Times and the Washington Post are making the observation, openly saying that these are flip-flops, apparently, based on her stump speeches versus what she's actually been supporting over the last years. So where are we then, in your view, coming out of this convention? Will she actually have to face any sort of press scrutiny, or do you think this campaign is going to be able to continue what has been a non-interlocutor approach to her campaign?
Well, I'll say first about the slick production of the campaign. Being inside the room, it is awe-inspiringly highly produced. It is highly choreographed. You can tell that they have brought in the very best minds of Hollywood and entertainment. And it's so easy to see how seductive that is for people. And, when you have John Legend, when you have Oprah, when you have Stevie Wonder, which was incredible, by the way, the Stevie Wonder performance was amazing. When you have that, it papers over the fact that really no new policy has been talked about, and really no policy of hers has been talked about at all outside of abortion. On Monday night, I saw somebody did a count, and this sounded true to me, that abortion was mentioned, I think, 117 times. Donald Trump was mentioned 140 times. But inflation was mentioned 3 times. The border, I think, was mentioned 8 times. And so there's this real concerted effort to move the sights toward Trump, toward abortion, and sort of get out of the way everything else. And for good reason. When Kamala Harris introduced parts of her economic plan, I think it was in North Carolina last week, her ideas on price gouging, on home affordability, were widely panned across the entire media, from the Washington Post, CNN, Politico. And if that was how her ideas were received then, it probably wasn't a good idea for them to go into any further detail at the convention. And so they've stayed away from it.
We've been talking to Peter Laffin, who's a Register writer at the Democratic National Convention here on Register Radio. Peter, we mentioned abortion a couple times. There was a Planned Parenthood van offering free medical abortions and vasectomies right outside of the convention. Abortion seemed to be one of the most unifying topics, but really, it's not that all Democrats are happy with that. And you spoke to the Democrats for Life. What did they have to say about this convention and the current platform?
Well, I spoke with Kristen Day, who's the executive director of Democrats for Life, yesterday. And my impression speaking with her is that she was someone who was sincerely heartbroken by this, that she really loves the Democratic Party. From listening to her, from reading up on her group, it seems that she believes in many of the other positions held by the Democratic Party very strongly, and she's trying her best to stay in the Democratic Party, though you can feel her relationship to it flipping. I think it's important to point out about the abortion bans. I know a lot has been said about that. But I think one thing that hasn't been said about that yet, and Ms. Day and I got into this a bit yesterday, is the brute fact of it has sort of yet to be fully processed in our media, in our collective psyche. Think about what happened this week. We had people who decided to wake up in the morning and go to the Democratic National Convention and get a vasectomy or an abortion as a political statement. That's an entirely new territory for our national discourse, for our national soul. It's understandable people would have reason to go to the Democratic National Convention. I know people think they have a reason to get a vasectomy and an abortion. But when you put the two together, you're in the area of political activism. You're using the very real life of a very innocent person, and you're destroying it to make a point,
right,
outwardly and openly. And I think we need to do a bit more to just sort of absorb the brute fact of that.
Absolutely.
That this is the place we've entered, and it's not normal.
Yeah.
I know much has been made in the campaign about what's weird and what isn't. And I think we just need to step back and say, this is really not okay. This is
right.
a totally new place we've entered into.
Right, and you've written about that at ncregister.com. There's an article there, The Democrats' Radical Shift from Safe, Legal, and Rare to Abortion Bans. And this is an analysis about the 2024 platform and how far away it is from 1992's Democratic Party platform. And that's by Peter Laffin at ncregister.com. We've been talking to Peter, but I also want to plug Catholic News Agency has more information on those Planned Parenthood vans. So Planned Parenthood mobilizes for Democratic Convention in Chicago, talks all about those vans. And we also have another piece by Peter Laffin at Catholic News Agency that was his conversation with Kristen Day of Democrats for Life. Peter, we're very grateful for what you have been bringing to us from the ground there in Chicago, and I know there's a lot more analysis to be had, so thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, Jeanette, it was my pleasure, and thank you, Matthew.
You've been listening to Register Radio on EWTN Radio. I'm Jeanette DeMello, and we're going to be taking a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about cell phones in schools or not. This is Register Radio on EWTN. Stay tuned.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Jeanette DeMello, Executive Director of the National Catholic Register and Catholic News Agency, your host here on Register Radio with my co-host Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. And we're delighted to be joined by another EWTN News colleague, Roselle Reyes, who reports for EWTN News in depth. And we're talking about back to school time for many students around the nation. And as kids pack their bags for class, they may think twice about bringing one item with them, and that's their cell phones. Some schools have been limiting use in school, and some schools have been outright banning cell phone use during the day. So EWTN News has been following the merits of this movement towards cell phone bans in schools, and Roselle has been leading that for us. She wrote about it, or let's say we write at the Register, but she does TV news. So she did a segment for this at EWTN News In Depth on August 23rd. Roselle, I'm so grateful that you're joining us on radio, and I'm very interested in this topic. So first of all, can you give us an overview of the news about cell phone bans or limits?
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's a bipartisan effort right now to crack down on students' cell phone use in school. According to Education Week analysis, so far at least 11 states, including Florida, Ohio, Indiana, Minnesota, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, have either passed laws or enacted policies that ban or restrict use of cell phones in schools statewide, or recommend their local districts to enact their own bans or restrictive policies. And some states like Utah and Arkansas want to go even further, banning minors from using apps such as Instagram and TikTok. And if I can just mention some of the more recent changes, in June, Los Angeles Public System, that's 500,000 students, 1,000 schools, voted to ban cell phones during the day. So that starts in 2025. Just this month, Governor Gavin Newsom asked California school districts to implement some restrictions on cell phones in classrooms. And also this month, Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia signed an executive order to make public school classrooms cell phone free. And I know Governor Kathy Hochul of New York said she would propose restrictions in 2025 as well to protect young people's mental health. So she started a statewide listening tour in July, listening to students, educators, parents, etc. So a lot of moving parts here in different states.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating to me. I kind of got tuned into this just having my own kids in school, and they don't have cell phones yet. They're young enough that they don't have them, but just being more and more aware of what kind of screen time they had. I just locked into this conversation really big time because I'm in Louisiana, one of those states that for the public schools are restricting access. So I'm really grateful that you've kind of brought us the news of this. But let's talk a little bit about what some of the reasons for these restrictions are. Some of it comes a bit from data. Right.
So like myself, I'm a mom too, but two younger children. And so it's interesting to hear all these different conversations, right? There are several reasons for the restrictions, but I think the main reasons stated are to benefit students' mental health and their learning. According to the Pew Research Center in April, they found that 72% of high school teachers and 33% of middle school teachers in the U.S. said cell phone distractions were a major problem during class.
Yes.
So what they're trying to do is have less distractions in the classroom, which also means teachers will be happier, less pressures on them, the students that take a toll on their mental health, which stems from social media.
Right. Sorry, I stepped on your words a bit there because that's the part that I've been so interested in. Yeah, absolutely. You know, teachers are saying, there's way too much distraction here. So it's very natural for the teachers to be concerned, I think, and that research is really fascinating. But I've been listening to a book which you can read. It's Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation, and this book is all about how teens' mental health has been challenged and disrupted by cell phones and screen use and social media and whatnot. So a fascinating book, and I hope, I know we've been after having an interview. EWTN has wanted an interview with Haidt for a long time, but his work has really highlighted this issue too. Matthew, you'd like to jump in. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, Roselle, I'm very curious about how people are reacting. It seems as though that the whole idea of this has emerged very swiftly just in the last months or few years. But what are you seeing in terms of how parents are reacting, and even down to like the Washington Post's reaction to all of this?
Yeah, so as part of my package, I wanted to interview regular people out on the streets, men on the street, that's what they call it. So I interviewed a variety of people, young and old, and overwhelmingly, they support the cell phone bans in the classroom. A grandmother says there is no reason kids should have cell phones in the classroom, and if parents are concerned, then send their children to school with the basic flip phone. And I interviewed a group of teens, and a handful of them, most of them say they're fine with no phones because it is a distraction. One high schooler said, no, I think it should be up to each person if they want to distract themselves or not. And in my package, I interviewed a former Catholic school teacher in Alexandria, Virginia, who told me that she spent more time redirecting students in the classroom than she did teaching. So it was a constant struggle for her.
Wow. So you've been listening to Register Radio on EWTN. I'm Jeanette DeMello with my co-host Matthew Bunson. We've been speaking to Roselle Reyes, who's an EWTN news reporter. She wrote on, or she did a package on In-Depth, EWTN News In-Depth on August 23rd, which can be found at the EWTN app. And you look under EWTN News in Depth, or you just search EWTN's YouTube channel, and you'll find the August 23rd story segment on this topic with cell phones in schools. Roselle, you mentioned that you talked to some Catholic people related to a Catholic school administrators about this in that segment. What did they have to say? How are Catholic schools responding?
Yeah, so I interviewed Principal Oscar Ortiz. He's the principal for Nolan Catholic High School in Texas, and they have been cell phone free for 2 years now, and he says they love it. Every morning, cell phones must be stored in lockers. Students can't use their devices during breaks, and if a phone is confiscated, a small fine must be paid. So he said the most visible change they've seen in the hallways, students are looking up instead of looking down on their phones. They're greeting teachers, students, engaging in conversation, and just being physically and mentally there at the time. And he even said a student told him that the first year they implemented this policy, that it was the best pep rally ever because they're not worried about other students recording them or being silly, or they just get to be themselves, and they don't have that extra pressure. And then I also interviewed the principal of Galen Catholic School in Iowa, and he says the same. They tested out no cell phones last semester of the school year in spring, the 2023-2024 school year, and they start school tomorrow, and the policy is now permanent because they saw so many benefits.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems to make so much sense. I think that's one of the findings of Jonathan Haidt, as he's researched this topic. Again, that book is The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And in that book, he talks about the fact that kids don't always know how to interact because they're so often interacting on devices. So when they're together, everybody's got their heads down and they're looking at their screens rather than looking at each other and enjoying each other in face-to-face reactions. And that changes dynamics, and it makes them less prepared for the real world, where obviously we have to engage. So I think it's really fascinating. Especially, Roselle, that you were able to talk to some teens who did agree. Did any of them object?
Just one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not bad. I know, I have seen some. I think the Washington Post this week had an editorial on this very topic. And while they, in theory, supported restrictions and policies surrounding cell phones, they also were trying to protect what they called, the freedom of speech, I guess, for teens, that we wouldn't in some way limit their freedom of expression or freedom of speech by bans. But I failed to be convinced by that. In the school day, this is more of a distraction than an opportunity for free speech.
Right. And if I can, one of the most interesting to me and what I loved about Jonathan Haidt's book is that he says people need to be tied into a community. And so according to his years of research, he found that religious kids are happier than secular kids. They're less anxious and less depressed because religious kids are rooted in faith, traditions, community, like going to church every Sunday. So that makes me happy and less scared about my child, who's only 10 right now.
Right. I mean, you and I were talking about that very thing, just making sure that we understand the effects of the screens on our kids. And I think we can encourage all of our listeners to be aware of what their school's policies are, but also just the home policy and being mindful of that. So again, I want to put in a plug for the EWTN News Nightly episode, EWTN News In-Depth episode that Roselle Reyes did on this very topic of cell phones in schools. That aired August 23rd. And also there is a review of Jonathan Haidt's book at ncregister.com. That's called Unplugged Childhood, Haidt's Battle Cry Against Early Smartphone Use. And you can again find that at ncregister.com. You've been listening to Register Radio, and we invite you to go to ncregister.com to find more news, analysis, and commentary online at ncregister.com. Thanks, as always, for joining us here on Register Radio on EWTN. Together with Matthew Bunson and today's producer, Michael McCall, I'm Jeanette DeMello, and I pray that until next week, God bless you.